Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be showing you a demonstration on how to make a watercolor value scale. So you'll remember from class that we made a value scale originally using charcoal, but you can make value scales using any kind of medium that you want. And today we are going to be using a watercolor, and I'm going to be using crimson. So some materials that you need before you start is a watercolor based paper, and I'm using a mixed media paper, and I've already made a scale on our paper so we can see what values we're going to be using. And the paper, I'm using a Strathmore mixed media, so this is an example of some paper that you can use. And then I have my watercolor available, and I have a palette pre-prepared with my base color already on, and I have a mason jar full of pure water, just tap water, whatever water you have. And today I'm using a brush that is actually used for India ink, but is a really great brush option for using watercolor because of its absorption. I also have some tissues on hand in case this gets a little messy. So the first thing we want to do when we're going to make our value scale is that this first spot is going to be our darkest value. It's important when you're working with paint to start with your darkest value because you're going to be mixing, and then your first value will be gone. So I am going to take my base. I'm going to just add a little bit of water, just a tiny drop, with my brush, just to get this water a little bit activated, or get the pigment a little bit activated. And then I'm going to take it and I'm going to fill my first square. You'll notice that your brush will dry out pretty frequently, so you'll have to go back and reactivate. But this will be the thickest activation that you use, or the thickest pigment that you use on this value scale, because the more water you add in watercolor, the lighter that it gets. So it's possible that I'll have to come back and add more pigment to this later. It already looks a little light in comparison to my base color, so I'm going to actually add a little bit more. So when we talk about value scale, our first section is our darkest value. The thing that we want to be the darkest in our composition. And in the case of this pigment that I'm choosing, the truest to its original form. So this is the color that the manufacturer made and that came out of the processing plant. That is the crimson I am going for right here. Alright, so now we're ready to move on, and you'll notice that this is a 6-part scale. So we're going to try to transition from the darkest dark to the lightest light in 6 stages. So I'm going to go back to my water, and you'll notice that it's already gaining the pigment. And I'm going to take my brush and add a little bit more. The thing about watercolor is that it has a transparent quality, which means that the more layers that you add, the darker that it's going to get, which is really nice when you're working in this way, because I can always go back and add more layers. Now typically if we're working with watercolor, we wouldn't want it to be upright like I have it right now, because the water can run down into places that we want to get. So you'll notice here, and I'll see if I can focus, that these two transitions are really abrupt. And that's not what a value scale is about. It's about reaching these qualities in a subtle manner so that we can see all of the transitions that are available. So what I want to do is I want to come back and add another layer like I was talking about. It may need some time to dry. I notice that it's a little wet, so it's still running down the page. I'm going to use my towel to kind of dab some off and maybe take a little bit of that paint off of it. So we're going to move on to the next one. I'll come back to that. And we're going to maybe try to reach slightly darker than this. You notice already how if I'm taking from the same area on my palette and adding more water, the contrast between the three it become really abrupt. So actually this tone I may want closer to over here because it's getting closer to the lightest value I can get. So my brush is getting a little wet, so I'm going to dry it off. Yeah, dry off my brush a little bit. Okay, let's try this again. I'm going to come in with a little bit more of my original tone. Keep filling in these areas. And remember that I'm coming back to this one because it is a little light for where I want it to be, but I have to wait for it to dry before I add another layer. Okay. So now I'm going to continue on adding a little bit more water. So, okay, I come on here and I'm like, that's too dark. That is too dark for what I want it to be. So instead of coming back and reloading on my palette, I'm just going to grab a little bit more water and take that to use to spread around the pigment that I already have. So right now I'm reaching my mid-tone. Well, these two are splitting my mid-tone. What I would consider to be my middle colors on my value scale. They will be the most neutral in contrast. Alright, I'm going to come back and step over back to my second scale and add another layer of pigment. Because like I said earlier, it's a little too light. So I'm going to reload a little bit. See, that is looking like a more subtle transition between my first and second. Alright, so I'm going to come back to this spot and I'm going to take a step lighter, so a little bit more water. We're almost reaching no pigment at all because our brush is already preloaded. So I don't really have to add a lot from my palette to reach this color. So you're seeing how we have a step 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and we should have a 1. And in all technicality, this one spot should be pure, but in the basis of using a watercolor or a pigment, we want to at least insinuate that there is some kind of pigment there. So I'm just going to dip my brush and whatever pigment is already on there into my water, which is very diluted, as you can see. And I'm going to use that pigment, the remaining pigment, to apply that to my value scale. I even think that this could be just a step bit darker. So I'm just going to add a little bit more from my palette, and I'm going to add it to my value scale. So when we're labeling our value scales, I'm just going to use my paintbrush because I don't have a pencil or a pen here. But we label from 1 being the lightest value to 5, or 6 being the darkest value. So I'm going to start at 1 and say this is the lightest value I want to achieve in my composition. And take it to a 2. To a 3. To a 4. A 5. And a 6. And as you'll remember from our lesson, value scales can be as long or as short as you can make them. The problem with the shorter value scale, like you'll see here, is that we miss a lot of the transitions that you could technically have. But here, we're getting, I think, a pretty good representation. We can maybe get a little bit lighter on our watercolor, but we're getting a pretty good representation of the darkest to lightest values available from this medium. So that's all I have for you guys, and I hope you find this valuable and you use it in your assignments. Thank you.